All right, the votes are in, and apparently everyone is switching to the Codex app right now. But wait, didn't we just switch to Claude Code a few months ago? And didn't we just switch to Cursor a few months before that, and Copilot a year before that? Yes, the tooling space has been an absolute mess recently, and there's been a lot of tools that I've chosen to ignore. But there's something about the Codex app that genuinely feels like the next chapter in how we're going to be using coding agents. So I want to talk about how it works, what's interesting about it, and whether or not I would actually switch for my terminal workflows to Codex. The answer might surprise you. Let's jump into the first reason I think people are so hyped on this, which is form factor, because it doesn't feel like a coding tool for the first time. When we were using Cursor, it felt like an IDE. When we were using Claude Code, it was a TUI, so you can navigate around, but unless you were a keyboard warrior, it wasn't as friendly to point and click. This feels like ChatGPT, but for code, which I think is what people were promised. That's why it's so exciting. And you can see all the buttons and knobs that you were probably looking for in other tools. For example, easily switching between different projects in a sort of keychain here. In other tools, you had to open up multiple windows perhaps, or manage terminal panes. But if you want to work on different projects in the same window, you can just click through and decide, I'm going to work on this project or that project, and you don't have to leave. You also get an option to whip up work trees quickly. A lot of people have been stumbling into a work tree pattern so that you can have multiple agents working on the same project without everyone stepping on each other. I have a video about why that's so useful. But you can just click on new work tree inside of here to enter that mode right away whenever you send your prompt. You also have options for environments. This is where their vertical integration kind of comes in, and we'll talk about that. And also a model switcher, which is very simple because it's scoped to the GPT series. You can choose your reasoning, and that's about it. And hopping into conversations, you see this fit and finish a little bit more clearly, where you get expanding and collapsing menus for all of the reasoning traces. You get inline file diffs with hover hints for all of the files that were edited, and a call to action to review the code in a side panel. All of this being very, very slick, sort of bringing an interface to the coding harness that you were already using. And I'll also drill into this sidebar here because this has got a lot of people talking. Normally, when you're working with agents, you're either scoped to whatever project you're currently building. Like in VS Code, whenever you have the project pulled up, you can only do things relating to that particular project. And when you're in a terminal, you have a lot more flexibility. You can have tabs, and every tab can have its own session working on its own project and things like that. They're kind of two ends of a spectrum. Here, they've added a very opinionated take that you can have multiple projects inside of the same window. Here I have two side projects that I'm working on. And then you can group any conversations that you have within that particular project. You may have seen solutions like this in the terminal space. CMux lets you group together multiple tabs into what they call a workspace. And there's also terminals like the Warp terminal that's adding in a tab groups feature where you can select multiple tabs, group them together, and perhaps you can get the same sort of effect, being able to group everything together by whatever project you're doing. But in Codex, they made it very on rails, so you don't have to think about any custom setups. It's just by default, putting everything together in a sidebar, which I think a lot of people are really latching onto. The second thing is the code review experience. You'll notice every time an agent does some work inside of the terminal and returns back to you, there is an option to review the output of that agent. You can easily hover and review in line if you just want to spot check a CSS change. Love that. But you can also click on this to get a full code review panel off to the side. And it really is a review panel. So first off, you can see full syntax highlighting for any files that you're working on. You also get a full file explorer to easily click around all of the files that were edited, which is rather nice. You can also go a bit deeper, clicking over here and opening all the files in the project. This is similar to like a read-only VS Code if you want to look at it that way. So if I wanted to see the full extent of app.tsx, I could actually just click into it right here. And this will give me the full file in line if I want to take a look. And you can't edit any of these files. The bet of Codex is that you will do a vast majority of your file editing using an agent rather than manual typing. This can be a little infuriating if you just want to edit a markdown file really quickly, but for code, I tend to agree. It's much easier instead of just editing the file to leave a comment to the agent. So that way, if you want to ask questions about a code change or you want to see changes in line, you can just send them off to the agent and have it work. This does mean that you are going to spend tokens for even the smallest edits. Now, Codex is smart enough to give you an escape hatch, so if you want to use an IDE to directly edit the file, you can, but it's clear what they're betting on. Code is going to become this read-only artifact where you're mostly interfacing with it using an agent. So that's the first thing that they built. Even a year ago, it would have been unheard of to build a read-only file browser, but it seems like that's the future we're living in now. Another aspect is how granular this code review can be. You'll notice all the usual tricks to diff against whatever's going on in Git. If you want to look at all of your unstaged changes, you can do that. If you're on a worktree branch and you want to diff against the main line, you can also do that, both origin and local, which is very convenient. But the most interesting one is this last turn option. And this is no longer scoping by Git. This is scoping by whatever you've done in the conversation up until that point. So if you wanted to understand what the agent did on the last turn and then give comments to it there, you could do so. This also lets you review code that was written by an agent that is outside the scope of the project. For example, I use the handoff skill pretty frequently to write handoff documents for other agents to work on sort of unrelated threads in our conversation. And you can see it writes them to a temporary directory here for me to use. And I can hover and see all of those changes, or I can hit review to see those handoff documents and even give comments to the agent if I wanted to change an aspect of this. Ever since I used a tool with this feature, I found that I'm much lazier with actually committing my code because I kind of trust that I can get to a code review from my conversation context rather than hand-holding all of the commits to make sure I always have a perfect point to go back to. Maybe that's irresponsible. Maybe that's the future and Git is going to die. I have no idea. But it is interesting how this one button removed a whole class of problems in my workflow where I don't really think about commits as much as I do code changes turn for turn. And I think that speaks to another interesting part of this, which is vertical integration. The Codex app is unique to other tools in that it is integrating the model with the harness with the tool wrapping around it, for better or worse. This is one example of how combining the harness, which is Codex and all the tools available to Codex, with the app surrounding it, which is the Codex app, can lead to some nice outcomes. Because it knows all the turns in a conversation, the app can give me a diff view that's not backed by Git, but is rather backed by the Codex conversation. Another example of this is the approval model, where down here I can easily switch between whether the agent's always going to ask me whenever it makes a change, whether I can have another agent sort of review the work of the previous agent, a double-blind review, or give it full access to my disk whenever it's working on things. This is the nicest breakdown of permissions I think I've seen across models that, again, connects the tool to the harness to the model in a more seamless way. Now, there's also the other side of the coin with this vertical integration, where I no longer have access to other frontier models if I need to. Now, you could argue GPT 5.5 is ahead, it's very quick, it has different reasoning levels that makes it pretty decent as a planning partner as well. And I agree, you could use GPT for everything. But the curse of knowledge has shown me how Claude is actually a really nice planning partner because it tends to be more creative than Codex. And at least in the terminal, I was very used to using Claude as a planning partner and then having Codex handle some of the implementation. Switching to a tool where everything's vertically integrated, you don't have that flexibility anymore. So you kind of have to decide, is this extra bit of UX, like the last turn button or the approval process, actually worth that lock-in? Or is it worth sacrificing some of those niceties to get some more flexibility on the model side? Definitely sound off in the comments if you have thoughts about this, because I know you probably do. So the final question for me at least is it worth switching off of terminals into a new sort of agentic IDE like the Codex app? Tooling-wise, it is quite incredible to have all of this stuff baked in, but I think there are two fundamental parts that make it a tougher sell. One of those is model lock-in. I still do believe that using Claude for planning and exploratory work is a nicer experience than using GPT 5.5. And in a world where switching models is an asset, as an engineer, it is nice to use tools that let you try multiple models in one place. I happen to use the Warp terminal, but because everything is available as CLIs, you could use whatever tooling you want for that sort of thing. And the second aspect is all of the extras, like being able to group together related projects in a tab viewer, having a code review panel to interact with the agent while you're working, all of that good stuff. And I've found there are still other tools that get you 90% of the way there without locking you into a model. Like I mentioned, the Warp Terminal is adding a tab grouping feature that gets you pretty close to that experience. There are also a number of tools available to get experiences like code review or file editing inside the terminal. Warp is this built-in code review panel that also lets you diff against branches and uncommitted changes. Because it's not tightly integrated with the harness in this case, you don't get last turn, so you do need to go back to managing everything using Git, but you get everything else, like being able to view all of the files in line, and you also get a bit of LSP support and direct file manipulation, so you don't need to open a separate application to edit the files that you're working with. So with those in mind, I think there's still value in using these sort of harness agnostic tools like terminals. But I will admit, seeing the extra bit of gloss that you get using a purpose-built application like Codex, I think this really is the next chapter in how we're going to be working with agents. We're going to spend less time editing files and more reviewing agent output, which is why Codex is kind of a review-first application. And for better or worse, I think the tools we're using are going to be deeply integrated with models more and more going forward, computer use being the first taste of that sort of thing. So let me know, what tools are you using right now, and how do you feel about tightly integrated tools like the Codex app? I'm personally super optimistic. There's so much innovation going on right now. Just a few months, the Codex app didn't even exist. So if you're excited for the future of coding agents and you want to learn a bit more, drop a like and subscribe. I'll be doing a lot more videos like this. See you in the next one.